You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. Does what we see and experience from our environment shape our behaviors? Does it matter if we live in a crowded city or on a vast range where the nearest neighbor may be miles away? When we live on land that is shaped into squares rather than random shapes, does that cultural landscape create patterns which we take for granted, but which changes how we think and interact with others? In this podcast, Leah Hood, a geography teacher who grew up in a rural Iowa farm, explores this geographic notion. On some devices, this podcast shows visuals, chapter controls, and clickable internet links. This podcast also appears on YouTube on the MAGE Geography channel. This podcast is directed at middle school geography teachers and students and addresses several Minnesota geography standards. Leah Hood teaches AP Human Geography at Lakeville South High School in Minnesota. In 2013, Leah was nominated for the Minnesota Council for Social Studies Teacher of the Year. I'm Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Today, MAGE is talking to Leah Hood. And Leah has a background which comes out of rural Iowa. And Leah, your experiences as a young person growing up in Iowa have led to some generalizations about the relationship between land and human behavior. So first, can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, what life was like for you?
Yeah, sure. I grew up on a family farm in northeast Iowa, just outside of a town called Independence, Iowa. It's about 4 hours south of Minneapolis-St. Paul. And yeah, my dad is still farming. My sister and I now we're grown, but we were the sixth generation on my dad's side of the family to grow up on this family farm. And my understanding is that it was homesteaded by one of my ancestors named James Hood, who came over from Scotland.
Okay, wow. It goes back quite a ways. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of the farming? What kind of crops, what kind of machinery? Do you have animals? What was the farm like?
Yeah, so now it is primarily a feed corn and seed corn operation as well as a hog farm. My Dad has 3 hog confinement buildings, and he is a part owner. I think it's 1/16 ownership of a company called Silvertop, which is a relatively new enterprise for him and an enterprise in general. It is a farrowing unit, so he now has, for the first time in my life, only in the past 5 or 6 years or so, I think, he now has some baby pigs that he raises. For most of my life, he had hogs that he would get at a certain weight and then raise to a certain heavier weight and then sell. But now he kind of has vertically integrated somewhat because he now has part ownership in the females, the mothers who birth the piglets, and then the baby pigs as well, on up through adulthood.
So you raise hogs on the farm? Do you have any other animal husbandry going on there?
Not anymore. We had beef cows as well until I was about 15, until my first couple of years of high school. And then actually they all got pseudorabies and died. And there was this, well, they didn't all die, but many of them died. And there was an interesting just sort of convergence of factors at the time that this disease struck a large part of the herd. Cow prices were down and hog prices were up, and my dad's dad was having to exit farming because he had Alzheimer's, and so my dad just got rid of the beef cows at that point in favor of more hogs because they were more lucrative and less work.
And what about the land? Did he farm the land, till the soil, and raise crops? And if so, what did that look like, and what kind of crops?
Yeah, my dad has soybeans, and he also has feed and seed corn. It's really just, at this point, it's really just my dad. My dad is the only farmer now. For many decades, it was my dad and my grandpa Hood, his dad, until he passed away. But he has, my dad has tractors. He uses a lot of farm equipment and machinery. He does not have a combine, and that's true of most farmers in the area. The combine to harvest in the fall is a really, really expensive piece of equipment, and it's really common for one guy to own the combine and then to kind of contract out combining services to farmers like my dad.
And are the fields quite large?
Yeah, they're big. We have about 440 acres. Most of it is contiguous, I guess, for lack of a better word. Most of it is in one chunk. There are 80 acres that are sort of separated out from the rest that were acquired at some point, sort of after the original chunk of land.
And so would you say this is typical of northeastern Iowa, that farms will be isolated a little bit from each other and have some animals, but also have quite large fields that they till with fairly large machinery?
Yeah, the landscape is all across Iowa is very similar in my opinion.
And so you grew up in that environment, and then you became a geography teacher, and so that has spurred some thoughts you have about the relationship between human behavior and what we do with the cultural landscape. Would you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I was thinking about this podcast, I had my ninth grade AP Human Geography students in mind, and one thing that it takes a lot of practice to get them to be good at starting to look at in the world and analyze and be able to do that independently is the concept that how we choose to use land and those patterns, those geometric patterns that we talk about in the early days of the course, those distribution properties, how patterns actually impact people's lives, the lives of kids and the opportunities that you have or don't have. And I wanted to create a podcast that could help my students and hopefully other people's students better understand some specific real-life examples of how our choices with regards to land use and land use patterns can actually have sort of a domino effect in impacting and influencing other aspects of our cultures and our lives.
Well, let's go through a few of those different categories of things that you've thought about.
Yeah, I guess the big one that I always think about, and maybe it's because my mom is a teacher and I'm a teacher as well, so I kind of have that mentality of, farmer, teacher, and links between education and the farm. But our fields, the fields of my family's farm and of the farms in the area, they're pretty expansive, and because we choose to use the land for agricultural purposes rather than for other purposes, and because we choose as a culture to use the land for commercial agriculture and high-tech commercial agriculture rather than more subsistence agriculture, there are some effects on population density. Where I'm from, and a lot of rural areas across Iowa and other parts of the United States, the population density is relatively low. And I think that is directly because of how we have parceled out the land for agricultural purposes to individual families, and oftentimes to one farmer like my dad, who then farms hundreds of acres basically by himself, which he's able to do because of technology, agricultural technologies. And so I think that the size of our farms and the fact that they're being farmed by fewer farmers, both because technology allows for that and because farmers and their families want to maximize their profits, they want to be able to farm more land in order to make more money, it creates a a very low population density, and then that in turn creates small schools, small class sizes in schools, and all kinds of things down the line. Like I was able as a high school student and a middle school student to participate in any activity that I wanted to participate in. I mean, I played volleyball and basketball and track and softball, and I was on the student council and mock trial teams, and I was in speech and debate, and I was in musicals and plays and choir, and I mean, part of that was my personality, but I do think that it was possible because there were fewer kids in my school, and now I teach in a relatively large South suburban school in the Twin Cities metro area, and students in many ways in Lakeville, Minnesota have more opportunities than I had in terms of extracurriculars. There are a lot more options, but their participation rates are more, it's not that their participation rates are less, but they have to be more focused. So if you want to play on the volleyball team at Lakeville South, you got to be pretty good because there's a lot of competition, and kids tend to specialize in their activities because of the competition from a higher population density within the schools. And I just didn't have to do that. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it's different, and I do think it is a direct result of how we use the land.
I think it's a clear example of use of the land impacting who we are, even for kids growing up. Any other examples you want to discuss?
So I think our land use patterns in Northeast Iowa, where I'm from, around Independence, also impact all kinds of other aspects of our culture and our economy. It certainly impacts the number and types of businesses that are in our community, and because of space-time compression and the different types of expansion diffusion that are allowed or sort of created as a result of our communications and transportation technologies, people can have access, even in rural Iowa, to all kinds of products that can be brought in. But in terms of the local businesses, I mean, not all of them, but there are certainly many that are geared towards farmers and the needs of farmers, and that is a result of the way that we use our land. I think, in terms of other like functional areas and things like that, the size of the towns, the population density, because of how the land is used, is really limited. You can only, small towns like where I'm from can only have so many businesses that are going to make it and be viable because of the concepts of threshold and range. How far are people going to be willing to travel, and how far are they going to be able to travel to get to certain types of stores and restaurants and movie theaters and coffee shops, and that really impacts what in a town like Independence, what businesses are able to make it versus what businesses kind of get pushed out by, bigger areas like Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Cedar Rapids, where people can go there, they can drive there and they can find more goods and services, more variety, and they're willing to do that. And it has an impact on what businesses can make it in Independence. Other things that I can think of that are pretty concrete are just like the size of the yards that people are able to have and the size of the houses. I think where I'm from, houses can be pretty big. Like the house that I grew up in, the farmhouse, is almost 2 times the size of the house that I now own in Minneapolis. Another really big part of culture in Independence, Iowa, that I think is created as a direct result of how we use land, primarily in the area for agricultural purposes, is that in Independence and in places like Independence, you don't interact with a person or a group of people in just one capacity, usually. What I mean by that is it's very common for the people that you go to church with or that your kid plays softball with to to come in and out of your life on a regular basis. You see people everywhere. You see the same people, at the movie theater and at the grocery store and at the Friday night football game at the high school and at the school board meetings and in places of worship, and you work together, and the person that is your kid's math teacher is also their track coach, and their wife was your daycare provider, and the people that are your financial advisors at the local banks also go to church with you. So you see the same people, but in a lot of overlapping in different spheres or capacities. And I don't think that is true to the same extent in places like the Twin Cities and even the metro area, where people's social groups, I think, are a lot more compartmentalized. They don't overlap as much.
Well, these are certainly some interesting thoughts about how interaction and perception of the land influences who we are as people and our culture. One would think with this idea that you have, that students who are listening to this podcast and maybe working in geography classes could take that idea and apply it to elsewhere on this planet with regard to agriculture. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into any great detail about some of these other examples, but if you think about very different landscapes, physical landscapes like Southeast Asia, chains of island nations that have agriculture happening on them, places like Papua New Guinea, you're going to see very different land use patterns and agricultural land use patterns and very different ways of socializing and cultural traditions and norms that have arisen, that I think if you look for them and you start to think, and look through this lens, you'll find connections between how different people in different places use land for agricultural purposes in their locations and how that shapes their social relationships as well.
Well, Leah, thank you very much for sharing with us your background and some of the thoughts that were generated by that background. And I hope that we have given students a little, as you say, a prism to look at other places. You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a non-profit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.